So Andor is a thing.
He's doing Star Wars! Nobody panic! This is not a drill! Get your nastiest comments ready and prepare to fire broadside at this poorly drawn YouTuber for having an opinion!
Whoa, okay, hold on. Let's just back up there for a minute. At least hear me out, because that's really what today's video is about. My relationship with Star Wars is complicated. I was a kid when the prequel trilogy came out, and while they're not amazing movies, they did succeed in getting me interested in the franchise as a whole, which I think is partially the point of why they were made. A new Star Wars for a new generation. After Phantom Menace, I went back and watched the original trilogy, or Orig-Tridge for short, and then proceeded to watch Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith as they came out. I was not overly attached to any of the films, prequel or Orig-Tridge, but the world building was great. But what really made me a Star Wars fan was the Clone Wars animated TV show. I don't care how you feel about animation, that show was tops for both television and Star Wars. And for me, it was the first time I felt more like a fan than just a casual viewer. But things started to change when Disney took over.
Something terrible has happened.
One of the things that Disney did when taking over the Star Wars franchise was announce their intention to create a sequel trilogy that would be set after the events of the Orig-Tridge. But in doing so, they wanted to cut down what was canon from the extensive expanded universe, and this included the Clone Wars TV show. Eventually, they would walk that back, but for me, the damage was done. How could I, a great Star Wars fan, trust a company that was willing to throw away the best part of the franchise? At least the best part in my opinion. This made me hesitant to trust Disney, which is a state everyone should be in all the time. And then The Force Awakens came out, and it was okay. There are some neat things about this movie, and the setup was decent. The promise of an epic story was definitely there. This was followed by Rogue One, and while it does feel like a bit of an unnecessary in-between quill, it is my favorite Star Wars movie to date. Then shit hit the fan with The Last Jedi. People lost their fucking minds, and I can see why. There were a lot of things that seemed to call into question some of the core tenets of what made Star Wars Star Wars. And while I have my thoughts on some plot points, I did like that this movie was attempting to change the way fans looked at the franchise. But the community became fractured, and there was much lashing out and gnashing of teeth at the backlash to the backlash to the backlash, which caused someone at Disney to panic, and the result was The Rise of Skywalker. Instead of being an interestingly flawed movie like the prequels or The Last Jedi, which was divisive, but at least it had a point, The Rise of Skywalker was a nothing film about nothing that said nothing. You just know someone got fired for that decision. But it wasn't The Rise of Skywalker or The Last Jedi or even Disney that ruined Star Wars for me. It was the fan base. After The Last Jedi, I felt like the fandom imploded. It became hard to talk about Star Wars without starting a heated debate. I wanted to share my thoughts and feelings about the movies, but I started keeping them to myself in order to keep the peace. And before anyone accuses me of pointing the finger, I will be the first to admit that I was definitely an overly opinionated fan that contributed to that environment. Nobody hates Star Wars more than Star Wars fans is a common refrain now used to describe this phenomenon. And it was exhausting to be a Star Wars fan. And so I stopped caring. And eventually my apathy over the discourse led to my apathy over the franchise. Star Wars is now going through a bit of a renaissance with its TV shows. The Mandalorian is hugely popular, the Book of Boba Fett was apparently interesting enough, Obi-Wan gave people a nice nostalgia trip, and let's not forget the animated shows like Bad Batch and Rebels. But through all of that, I couldn't bring myself to care. The community was so loud that it was hard to be a fan, so I just chose not to be a part of it. Until last year, where a friend of mine who is a huge Star Wars fan messaged me and said I should watch Andor. I'm used to this because people keep pestering me about The Mandalorian, but this friend told me that Andor wasn't just good for Star Wars, which isn't a high bar, but some of the best television he has ever seen. So I watched the whole season and I was blown away. The show is like the epitome of how to make a world and characters come to life through characterization, acting, and set design rather than exposition. While the show is not action-packed and can be a bit of a slow burn at times, it was spectacular. I know it's probably not going to be the most popular piece of Star Wars media, but I liked it enough that I think I might be willing to once again call myself a Star Wars fan. Not just because the show is so good, and it is, but because I also have a different perspective on how I view fandoms, particularly ones with the toxic label. This has to do with what it means to be a fan, the way fans interact, and how fandoms affect and reflect the thing they revere. And I'm going to do this with the Star Wars fandom as an example, as well as the discourse around it, and include this new show. And so today, I want to talk about Andor. For those that don't know about Star Wars, how would you even do that if you live in Western culture. The now expansive multimedia phenomenon started with director George Lucas making a fairly simplistic narrative on the big screen. The first movie was just called Star Wars, and it was released in 1977, and while the plot was pretty basic, the world it took place in was filled with amazing science fiction creatures and ideas that had previously only been seen in cheesy space operas. But Lucas's direction brought the world and technology to the big screen in a way that was far beyond the pulp fiction before it. This was in large part thanks to the outstanding technical advancements and achievements in movie making by the crew. These effects elevated the technology and creatures that occupied the world to a state where they became believable. The movie was so stupidly successful that it was renamed to Star Wars: A New Hope and called not the first, but the fourth movie in what would be a 6-episode movie spectacular. A New Hope was followed by The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. After working on other projects, Lucas decided to return Star Wars to the big screen. In 1999, the first of 3 prequels was released with The Phantom Menace, followed by Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. And that was the conclusion of the Skywalker saga. Except it wasn't, because in 2012, Disney did what it does best and bought LucasArts and all of the intellectual property associated with it, including Indiana Jones, Willow, and of course, Star Wars. Also, Grim Fandango. But mostly Star Wars, because they immediately set in motion plans for a sequel trilogy that would continue the events of the Skywalker saga. Because money. They also created 2 standalone movies in Rogue One and Solo, but after The Last Jedi's rocky reception from the fandom and Solo's lackluster performance at the box office, they pulled the reins hard and canceled all other movie projects at the time. Disney strategically waited for the dust to settle on Rise of Skywalker before announcing its plans to bolster its new streaming service with a litany of Star Wars content. They finished out the Clone Wars animated series and announced numerous television shows and miniseries, including the return of known names like Lando, Andor, and Ahsoka, as well as brand new stories from all over the timeline like The Acolyte, Bad Batch, and the hugely popular Mandalorian. Andor got its start when the creatives behind LucasArts and Disney started looking into stories that could be told outside of the Skywalker saga. Cassian Andor was a character that piqued their interest. He was featured heavily in Rogue One, but the movie focused on Jyn Erso, meaning Andor was a character shrouded in mystery. Eventually, Tony Gilroy, the writer and director of the reshoots on Rogue One, was brought on board as showrunner with plans to direct several episodes. Unfortunately, production and filming were all set to take place in London, and because of the global health crisis, UK-based Toby Haynes was already on a list of directors for the series, but wound up directing the lion's share of episodes in Gilroy's place. The show was treated like a film and even had a 3-block city set created for the planet Ferrix. The show's creature designs were also handled by the same team behind all of the Disney-era films, making the show feel truly like it belonged in the time frame. I was especially impressed with how they integrated the look of the Empire's technology from the Origintrige. The first of 2 seasons was released in parts over the course of several weeks and boasted some huge names. Diego Luna of course returns, but Genevieve O'Reilly reprised her role as Mon Mothma, Forrest Whitaker returns as Saw Gerrera, and Stellan Skarsgård plays a brand new character. Plus there's a few other surprises, but I won't spoil those for you. Speaking of spoilers, I'm gonna have to drop a few, but Star Wars is so huge it's mostly gonna be about Andor and Rogue One, so if you haven't seen the show or that movie, this is your spoiler warning. Set between the events of Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope, and 5 years before Rogue One, we are introduced to Cassian Andor. While trying to find a clue to his sister's whereabouts, Cassian kills 2 security officers in self-defense. He knows that this is probably going to cause trouble, so he asks his friend Bix to set up a meeting with a seller so he can gain some cash when he sells some stolen Imperial tech. Unfortunately for Cassian, an overly zealous Primor security member decides to take a special interest in his case and begins a manhunt for him. Cassian meets with the buyer, Luthen, a man who turns out to be interested in Cassian because of what he can do rather than what he has stolen. He helps Cassian escape Primor security and offers him a job on the planet Aldhani. Cassian joins a small group of insurgents on a heist of an Imperial fortress. Meanwhile, the Primor security screw-up has drawn the attention of the Empire and the Imperial Security Bureau, basically the space CIA. Cassian is worried that the ragtag team put together on Aldhani will crack under the pressure, but to his surprise, they pull off an impossible task and steal a massive amount of credits from the Empire. But Cassian, being the kind of dude he is, he takes what he's owed and leaves. This attack causes the Empire and the ISB to put new oppressive laws in place, which it turns out was what Luthen wanted more than the money, because now people will want to rise up against the Empire. This ruthless scheme raises the indignation of Senator Mon Mothma, who's secretly working with the Rebel Alliance and Luthen while masquerading as a government official trying to push back against the overreach of the Empire. These new oppressive Empire laws are felt everywhere in the galaxy, including Ferrix. Being in the wrong place in the wrong time, Cassian gets picked up by a shore trooper and is sentenced to 6 years in labor under this new law. Inside the Imperial prison, he's forced to make parts for something, but the prisoners find out that their sentences are actually never ending and they're just sent to another facility until they die. So Cassian and the others plan a prison break and escape. Cassian and his friend Melshi agree that more people need to know about what is happening and decide to split up. Cassian finds out that his mother has died and realizes that the funeral is definitely a trap set up by the ISB to capture him. Luthen has made the decision to let some of his allies die for the greater good, and Mon Mothma is forced to either be found out as a rebel or marry her daughter off to the son of a dubious moneylender. So yeah, lots of shades of gray, and Season 2 promises to be even more morally ambiguous, with more Saw Gerrera, Luthen's shady actions, and Mon Mothma's rise to the leader of the rebellion. Also, Alan Tudyk is confirmed to be returning as K2SO, so that's awesome! There are a ton of reasons to be a fan of Andor. The story is paced amazingly well and ensures that you know all the stakes and characters before building the tension and allowing a natural progression towards a climax. The scope of the story slowly increases, starting with just Cassian and his immediate acquaintances before bringing in members of the ISB and rebel leaders. The connections between characters feels natural, and yet everything is interlinked. What started out feeling like 3 separate arcs centered around Cassian all lead to one logical conclusion for every character involved, and really shows character growth through experiences without having to say them overtly. It's truly a great television show, even when not compared to the rest of Star Wars. It does, however, do a lot for that universe, as for the first time the Empire feels truly sinister. The things they do to people are fucked up. If you've seen the show, then you know exactly what moment I'm talking about. Beyond that, the stormtroopers are genuinely scary, and I began to look at the Empire as this tyrannical and cruel bureaucracy rather than just the bad guys because they wore black and had red lightsabers. Bureaucracy is often the ultimate downfall for both the antagonists and protagonists. People and events are affected negatively by the circumstance, ineptitude, and apathy that comes with a bureaucratic organization, and this theme is weaved into the fabric of the show. So to say I'm a fan of the show is probably an understatement. I really enjoyed it. I'll probably watch it again along with Rogue One, and I cannot wait for Season 2. So am I a Star Wars fan again? It's worth making the distinction between being a fan and being part of a fandom. On the surface, they seem like the same thing, but there is a difference. Being a fan only requires your appreciation and enjoyment of the thing in question, what scholars refer to as an object. In this case, Star Wars is the object, but a sports team, personality, musician, or anything really can be an object. On the other hand, fandom is a bit more complicated. Fandom is the discourse and network of people around an object. The two play into each other, and if you're a fan, you're part of the fandom, but that doesn't mean you have to interact with the fandom as a whole. This sticky distinction is one of the big reasons that I and many others have trouble being fans of something, because you may spend no time interacting with the fandom at large in an attempt to distance yourself from it, but because you are a fan, you make up the collective unified network known as the fandom. This invariably means that you are generally connected to any discourse surrounding the object. What makes a person a fan is easy to answer. You enjoy the object. What is more difficult to answer is how you choose to show you're a fan, or how you appreciate the object, or choose not to. This is where the distinction between fan and fandom becomes very obvious, because a lot of fans start to gatekeep inclusion into a fandom. This isn't how fandom works, but many people think that you cannot be a true fan unless you prove your fandom in some way. So you get some people collecting paraphernalia obsessively, as though the amount of stuff you own dedicated to the object will solidify your status as the ultimate fan. And these people are a bit much. But you can spend your money however you like as long as it's not hurting anybody, so power to you. More problematic is the kind of fan that thinks that if they know more about the object, the better fan they are. I'm guilty of this kind of gatekeeping in the past. There's nothing inherently wrong with wanting to know all the trivia, lore, and factoids about the object you enjoy, but this can often lead to the mentality that the amount of knowledge you have makes you more of a fan than another person because they weren't aware of some obscure factoid, as though the measure of your enjoyment of something can even be compared to another person's. As I said, I'm guilty of this, but I had to learn to let this go because all it does is alienate people who might be looking for a place to learn more about the object. By attempting to gatekeep the fandom from so-called casuals, I was probably turning potential fans and maybe even friends away from the thing that I loved. The fandom should be there to spread the love, not hoard it. The amount someone likes a thing isn't based on their intimacy with the material or the number of things they own. It's a personal thing. You can't measure it, and it's not up to anyone else to debate or question that. I like Star Wars. I'm never going to be a fanatic about the lore. I know enough, but if someone starts off with, well, in the expanded universe, they might lose me. Does that make me less of a fan? Hell no. Why would it? It doesn't diminish my enjoyment. If that kind of knowledge increases your enjoyment, that's great, but we can't use that as a metric for whether someone is a fan or not. That isn't to say that this level of dedication isn't admirable, as long as it's not used to gatekeep. Being a dedicated fan based on your knowledge or collection can be wonderful, and sharing that with others is the goal of fandom. It's the people that are willing to share their passion that brings others in and creates better and brighter communities. This is why shows like Andor get made, because the people behind its creation are clearly stupidly passionate about the universe. The references that characters throw around in the show are a goldmine for those who know. Even if you're a casual viewer, the care is evident. The level of detail in props, the characters' writing, the inclusion of wider political and intergalactic events, it all screams that the people behind the show were some of the biggest Star Wars fans out there. I know Andor is not a show for everyone, but you can tell that this show was made by Star Wars fans. Fandoms can be a great thing. Being part of a community and discussing the object at length can bring you closer to people and to the appreciation of the object itself. Online is an easy way to find like-minded people, and these communities can be hugely supportive and formative, like I said on the episode I did on Carmilla. They're also a place you can gush about the ludicrousness of a show, which led to Riverdale's popularity, as I said in the episode I did on that show. It's basically paramount for a franchise to have a strong fan base these days. This fan base is usually measured by the amount of traffic they generate on the internet, meaning the more you discuss and engage with the fandom, the more likely the object in question will continue in seasons or sequels or sports things. Can you tell I don't watch a lot of sports? But like all things, you take the good with the bad. Many fandoms have contingents or separatists that are filled with negativity, and the internet, as I'm sure you know, is a wonderful place and is great at understanding nuance. That was sarcasm in case you didn't get that. Toxic fanbase is a word that gets thrown around, and it's generally how I used to see the Star Wars fanbase. It felt impossible to have any kind of conversation about this particular object without conjuring the ire of another person. This invariably led to arguments and insults, and man, I hate the internet. I could try to be a fan but avoid the internet and the fandom, but I think that's unhelpful. So instead, I had to start looking at the fact that fandoms are made up of fans. And that may seem kind of obvious, but when you break it down, it can really help you understand fandoms, even the toxic parts. Some fandoms get labeled as toxic because they are seen to rail against the object itself. The most famous recent example of this was Game of Thrones in regards to the show's final season. Now, there were definitely some people who were just nitpicking about production, and that probably could have been left to the wayside, but the writing in that season made a lot of people angry. And while some fans were nitpicking about non-things, the majority of people felt like they had a legitimate grievance. The mainstream media and the creators pushed back and labeled the fanbase as toxic because of course the internet doesn't understand nuance. Something similar happened with the Snyder Cut. Fans pushed back against the studio version of the Justice League, and eventually the Snyder Cut was released, and it certainly is a movie that happened. More recently is what's going on with The Owl House. If you're unfamiliar, I have a video going through what that show is and why it's great, but suffice to say, the show was cancelled and the reason given was its apparent lack of popularity. This turned out to be wildly untrue when the first season of Season 3 was released on YouTube, and it got millions of views within only a handful of days. The fanbase may not have been able to save the show, but they wanted to prove to Disney that they had fucked up on what could have been a huge piece of intellectual property. Fandoms now have more power than ever before. In the age of the prosumer, which is a word that I loathe with every fiber of my being, fandoms and by extension fans now have a say in the object more than ever. This is neither a good nor a bad thing, but it's a fascinating phenomenon that isn't likely to go away anytime soon, and so I'm willing to accept this if I want to be part of a fandom. Star Wars as a fandom is filled with people who are passionate about Star Wars, and we sort of forgot about that. Just like the characters in Andor, we've become such a large system that we continue to suffer under our own internal bureaucracy and inorganization. We have the capacity to make real change happen if we're able to push past our own ineptitude and apathy. When fandoms get out of their own way, we've seen them push back against bad decision making behind the object they love. This is great, but it's besides the point. It's hard for every single person to agree on one thing in a fandom, so instead, I think there should be an understanding that the goal isn't to make fans right or wrong, but that the appreciation for the object is why we get together, and then an adherence to one set of rules ultimately leads to homogeneity, which leads to oppression, which leads to apathy, and if you're paying attention to what happens in Andor, then you know that this will eventually lead to the downfall of any organization, good or bad. So yeah, I consider myself a fan again, but I did have to recontextualize the way I view fandom membership, the way I express fandom, and the role of fandoms in society. And I wouldn't have thought to research this topic if it wasn't for the reignition of my old passion in Star Wars. And that's due to the appreciation of the material and exploration of the world that only a group of fans could create. And that is why Andor is one of the best shows I have ever seen, and why it made me want to be a Star Wars fan again. Here are my stray thoughts. I'm actively thinking about trying The Mandalorian, mostly to get my editor off my back about it. I didn't get a chance to talk about the music of Andor, but it's also awesome. I really enjoyed how we follow the villains and heroes in the show, and I think the third arc was my favorite, but the second one was really good. I'm so excited for Alan Tudyk in season 2. That man is a treasure, and I guess my excitement proves that I'm a fan. Not that it ever needed proving, and you can never take it away from me. Hey, thanks so much for watching that episode. You can become one with the Force, and the Force will be with you if you hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe so you can check out any of the other videos that I mentioned, like the one on Owl House, Riverdale, or Carmilla, and stick around for lots more interesting ideas happening right here on Cinemaster's Ultimate Timeline.